At the far edge of the Andromedan spiral, nestled between the translucent rings of Archaean 6, stood the Galactic Academy of Advanced Intellect, a towering structure of sentient glass and gravitational architecture humming with the minds of the most brilliant young beings across hundreds of species. Inside its prime lecture chamber, under a dome that shimmered with simulated starlight, over 100 students from different worlds gathered in quiet anticipation. Some floated in fluid pods, others sat curled around spiral perches or hovered mid-air through anti-grav fields. In the very back row, alone and silent, sat Kyle Ward, the first human ever admitted to the Academy's elite math division. He was a thin young man with sharp features and a perpetually furrowed brow, his dark hair cropped short in accordance with Academy standards. While other species communicated through electrochemical pulses or bioluminescent flashes, Kyle relied on eye contact and instinct. He felt out of place here. Not because he didn't belong. He had passed every entrance test the Academy could throw at him, but because he was reminded constantly that most didn't believe he belonged. The entrance to the hall opened with a low-resonance pulse. Professor Zintor glided in, not walking but rather carried by a cluster of micro-thrusters embedded in his long silver robes. He was a tall, serpentine being from the planet Qualathar, with a skull shaped like an elongated crystal and 6 shimmering eyes that pulsed independently. His voice echoed before he'd even left his mouth, as if the space around him anticipated his thoughts. "Today," the professor began, "we address the limitations of interspecies computation. Limitations not in code or theory, but in cognition, in perception, in species with inadequate dimensional comprehension." He didn't look directly at Kyle, but everyone knew whom he meant. Kyle met the moment with silence. He had endured weeks of similar remarks, disguised as lessons, but always carrying the same subtext. Without waiting for further ceremony, Zintor summoned the problem. A shimmering spiral of light emerged from the center of the hall, unfolding layer by layer like a blooming alien flower. Symbols, some pulsating, some rotating, filled the air, covering over 30 virtual panels in the dome. Equations in no fewer than 7 notational languages spiraled outward, some grounded in conventional mathematics, others in fractal feedback logic and neural lattice computation. The holograms glowed in greens, purples, and shifting hues not found in any human color spectrum. The display felt alive, aggressive almost. "This," Zinthor declared, "is the polyaxion. Considered unsolvable for over 2 centuries, no computational species has yet achieved a full reduction. No theoretical mind has approached convergence. You may try, though I expect only further proof of your inadequacies." Around Kyle, the students stirred with excitement. A globular being named Farsal, from the planet Hexadon, cracked open her membrane to reveal a quivering cluster of cognitive nodules. A crystalline creature from Zetheron spun his limbs into a hexadecimal processing formation. Even a neural fog cloud named Dune shimmered into high-frequency oscillations. Attempting to decipher the patterns, Kyle simply stared. He wasn't sure what he was looking at. The equation wasn't just long, it was dense, like trying to read 7 languages through a waterfall. He let his eyes soften, not focusing on the symbols, but instead allowing them to blur, waiting for something else to emerge. Professor Zintor glided to the side, circling the class like a hungry predator observing prey. "Your species, human," he said with a smug inflection, "is still limited to base 10 numeric understanding and binary digital logic. You speak in finite sequences, you think in absolutes. That is why you fail." Kyle didn't flinch. He had heard worse back on Earth, even from his own kind. Professors who dismissed his instincts. Classmates who mocked his lack of formal academic background in multidimensional logic. But he wasn't here for them. He was here because somewhere deep in his mind, things made sense differently. He didn't solve problems linearly. He felt his way to truth. An hour passed. The class tried method after method, shifting logical frames, applying numerical decompression, interlacing recursive structures, and still the polyaxiom stood unyielding. Zinthor pretended not to enjoy their failure, but his spiraling pupils betrayed his satisfaction. "Perhaps," he mused aloud, "we've reached the natural edge of biological intelligence." Perhaps only a synthetic mind can surpass this barrier. Kyle's mind was far from such abstractions. He wasn't thinking about limits of species or the pride of professors. He was thinking about patterns, how each layer of the equation, despite its symbols and alien variables, had a rhythm. Some clusters repeated, some mirrored, others curled back into earlier panels like self-referencing lines of a song. It reminded him of something he'd seen long ago, when he was a child, watching raindrops fall on a puddle and form ever-expanding ripples. And then, quite suddenly, it clicked. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. In his mind, the spiral of symbols flattened, not into code, not into language, but into a shape. 3 vectors emerged, intersecting at their ends, enclosing a space. The entire 32-panel structure condensed itself into 3 fundamental forces, interacting at angles. It wasn't math, it was geometry. He opened his eyes, stood up slowly, and walked toward the front. A few students murmured in surprise. Zintor didn't look pleased. "The human believes he has a solution?" the professor asked with theatrical skepticism. "I don't have a solution," Kyle said calmly. "I have a translation." He took the stylus from its magnetic dock and faced the blank portion of the holographic screen. The class watched as he drew 3 simple lines, forming a triangle, nothing else, no variables, no coefficients, just a triangle. There was a pause. Some students snickered, others waited. Zintor's voice oozed with contempt. "You mock the academy with playground illustrations?" Kyle pointed to each vertex of the triangle. "This," he said, "is energy. This is pressure. This is flow. The entire equation describes their balance. The spiral just obfuscates the truth with unnecessary layers. You don't solve it with numbers. You see it, like this." Silence followed. Zintor narrowed his eyes, but said nothing. The rest of the class didn't know what to think. And then, slowly, one being moved. A plant-like assistant named Grohl, a quiet student from the bioluminescent world of Farada. She reached forward with a limb and entered Kyle's triangle into her computational module. The symbols reassembled, the variables collapsed, and suddenly, the entire polyaxiom reduced to a single constant, an ancient balancing factor used in planetary field equations. Gasps filled the chamber. As Zintor's posture stiffened, Kyle simply stepped back without another word and returned to his seat. He didn't need applause. He wasn't looking for validation. He had just seen what no one else could, and the triangle glowed quietly on the board, simple and undeniable, defying centuries of intellectual arrogance. Kyle didn't sleep that night. The silence of his private dormitory, an angular metallic capsule suspended within a quiet, gravity-free pod cluster, offered no comfort. He drifted in the middle of the chamber, eyes open, arms folded, as the faint hum of the artificial ecosystem pulsed gently through the floor and walls. His mind was replaying every flicker of the day's moment, not from pride or excitement, but from a tension growing in his chest like an approaching storm. The triangle was still glowing on the public lecture board when he left. No one had erased it. No one had spoken to him directly afterward. Professor Zintor had ended the session early, murmuring something vague about further analysis. The rest of the class had dispersed in stunned silence. Some of the students avoided looking at Kyle altogether as they exited the hall, as if his presence disrupted the established gravitational pull of their intellectual order. He hadn't expected praise. He hadn't expected gratitude, but he also hadn't expected the coldness. He had offered something real, something useful, and it had fallen into the void. Perhaps it had been too simple. Perhaps the truth felt like an insult. The next morning, Kyle arrived at the Data Observatory Center, a wide hall with transparent flooring that revealed the gas clouds of Arcan 6 churning below. Screens wrapped the circular chamber, each wall displaying a different field of study: gravitational harmonics, subatomic memory storage, hyperdimensional linguistics. The center was often where students cross-referenced research and collaborated, but this morning it was nearly empty, save for one presence. Grohl stood near the central projection orb, her light shoe tendrils pulsing softly in a contemplative rhythm. When she noticed Kyle, she didn't speak, but instead gestured him closer with a slight curl of her limb. Her eyes, or what passed to them, bioluminescent spots arranged in a spiral, focused fully on him. She extended one of her appendages into the projection orb. At once, a swirl of data lit the space between them, revealing a new equation, derived from the earlier triangle configuration. It was a simulation, a model of gravitational compression patterns inside unstable wormholes. Kyle stared as the projection pulsed in steady intervals, the geometry shifting in perfect balance. She finally spoke, her voice generated from a translation node embedded near her chest. Your model reframes 3 foundational constants across 12 disciplines. I verified the pattern through simulations. It holds. He nodded, unsure what to say. Groh was the only one who had responded, the only one who had dared to interact with him since yesterday. Her voice, though synthesized, carried an undercurrent of curiosity rather than judgment. Why didn't the others say anything? He asked, after a pause. Even if it was crude, it worked. Because it threatens the structure, she said simply, not the math. The authority. Kyle looked away. He had suspected as much, but hearing it spoken aloud left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had grown used to navigating systems where brilliance was measured by conformity, cloaked in complexity. But he had hoped the Academy, this last sanctuary of knowledge beyond planets and politics, would be different. She turned off the projection. Professor Zintor has filed an amendment request to the Galactic Theorem Board. He is attempting to include the ward reduction into existing theory. Without naming you. Kyle clenched his fists. He's stealing it? He is rebranding it, she replied, tilting her head. Attribution politics is common in Tier 1 intellectual circles. You are unbonded, ungrouped, without a planetary delegate. You lack advocates. It was true. Kyle had come alone. Earth didn't have an official representative on the academic board. The invitation he had received had been personal, extended after a research demonstration during an outreach program at Europa's orbital base. His inclusion had been exceptional, and now it seemed inconvenient. He exhaled slowly. Then I need to do something that can't be ignored. She regarded him carefully. If you want to challenge his claim, you must not only prove your method, but prove that it is reproducible and applicable beyond coincidence. Theory alone will not suffice. You need demonstration. Kyle looked back toward the simulation room's vault. Beyond it was the experimental applications sector, rarely used by first-year students, restricted in most cases. But access was not the problem. The problem was ambition. No one tested professors. Not openly. Not this way. But Kyle was no longer interested in staying quiet. Later that day, he submitted a request to the verification committee to perform a live application of the Ward Triangle on a volatile gravitational model, a small-scale energy dome meant to simulate collapsing planetary fields. He didn't expect the request to be granted, but by the end of the solar rotation, he received clearance. The stamp on the digital document bore not only the committee seal, but a signature. Grohl's. The test would be scheduled for the following cycle. He had less than 24 standard hours to prepare. He spent the night in the quantum lab, running dozens of variants of the triangle model against known instability problems. Rotational vortex loops, pressure field oscillations, spatial resonance gaps. Each time, the model held. What had begun as instinct was now sharpening into system. Every point of the triangle acted like a stabilizer, maintaining equilibrium by compensating for the shift in the other two. It was elegant, primitive in appearance, but brutally efficient. Just before dawn, as the planet's rings shifted their reflection through the dome windows, the lab lights flickered. Kyle looked up, expecting a power fluctuation. Instead, Professor Zintor emerged from the side corridor. He said nothing at first, simply floated near the doorway, observing. "You're working late," Zintor said finally, his voice low and coiled. Kyle remained at the console. "I have a test scheduled. I saw the submission. Ambitious. The triangle again, I assume." Kyle nodded once. Zintor drifted closer, his presence casting subtle distortions in the energy field of the room. "You believe you've found something universal. Perhaps you have. But know this. The Academy is not built on truths alone. It is built on the control of truth." Kyle turned, his voice steady. "Then maybe it's time that changed." Zintor's 6 eyes pulsed briefly, unreadable. "Be careful, Ward. Insight without support is indistinguishable from heresy." I've seen bright minds break themselves against this system, believing brilliance alone was enough. Kyle didn't flinch. I'm not interested in being brilliant. I'm interested in being right. The professor's form retracted slowly, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air as the door closed behind him. Kyle returned to his work, but he knew this was no longer just an experiment. The test tomorrow wouldn't simply prove the triangle. It would define his place in this world, or cast him out of it completely. And yet, for the first time in months, he felt utterly focused. No doubt, no noise, just purpose. He had seen the shape of balance. Now he would show the stars. The arena where the demonstration would take place was nothing like the lecture halls or quiet laboratories Kyle was used to. It was a massive octagonal structure known as the simulation crucible, nestled within the core of the Academy's third ring. Very few students had ever seen its interior, let alone been granted access to use it. The walls were layered with adaptive metal alloys, capable of shifting configurations depending on the type of experiment. Overhead, a dense array of gravitational projectors and energy stabilizers hovered in silence, waiting to be awakened. Kyle entered the chamber alone. His presence triggered the security scan and logged his identification. A series of concentric rings beneath his feet lit up in soft white pulses, acknowledging his access. He carried only a small case tucked under his arm, his entire model compressed into one slate no larger than a hand. When the doors sealed behind him with a low thrum, he found himself standing in the center of the most advanced real-space simulation zone in the galaxy, entirely by himself. The balcony surrounding the chamber slowly filled with silent observers. Faculty members, high-ranking researchers, and students in formal robes took their seats without ceremony. No one spoke to Kyle. No one waved. Many didn't even look directly at him. But they had come. That was enough. A voice crackled over the comm. "You have 10 minutes, Cadet Ward. Initiate the sequence when ready. No corrections will be permitted once the simulation begins." Kyle nodded toward the control panel, though he knew the AI monitoring him didn't require visual cues. He walked to the central console, placed his slate into the interface cradle, and watched as the triangle lit up, hovering above the projector in 3 distinct points of pale blue light. Each point represented one of the forces in his model: energy, pressure, and flow. They shimmered with a hum so low it seemed to vibrate in the chest rather than in the ears. As the simulation initialized, the platform beneath him began to rise. Transparent barriers formed around the perimeter, separating the test zone from the rest of the chamber. Overhead, a siren pulsed once, in warning. Then the energy field began to build. The test was designed to mimic a planetary collapse sequence, a rare but devastating phenomenon in unstable systems where gravitational irregularities consumed a world from within. The simulation wasn't just for show. The forces involved, though scaled down, were real enough to destroy a structure if left unchecked. Most students never attempted it. Even fewer succeeded. Kyle wasn't aiming for containment. He was aiming for stabilization, perpetual balance, derived solely from the triangular configuration. The moment the field surged to full capacity, Kyle activated the Ward triangle. Instantly, the chamber was filled with motion. Energy spiraled inward, waves of pressure compressed the core, and flow patterns pulsed outward like heat escaping a dying sun. But instead of collapsing into chaos, the triangle responded. It absorbed the inputs and distributed them across its 3 vertices, maintaining harmony. For a moment, it looked effortless. Then came the pushback. The simulation, pre-programmed to test failure limits, amplified the force. Unstable feedback loops emerged in the form of vortexes trying to disrupt the triangle's integrity. Kyle remained still, hands placed on the console, eyes locked on the triangle. The model flexed. The angles shimmered, not breaking, but adjusting, compensating for new variables in real time. Above him, the observers leaned forward. For many, this was the first time they'd seen a living model operate, not as an abstract diagram on a screen, but as an active, dynamic force capable of real-world stabilization. And it was working. Professor Zintor stood near the observation panel with his arms folded. His face betrayed no emotion, but his internal telemetry, monitored quietly by the Academy's data system, showed a spike in neural activity. He had expected Kyle to attempt containment. He hadn't expected equilibrium. Midway through the sequence, the triangle faced its first critical stress test. A simulated pulse quake, intended to mimic the gravitational shock of a collapsing moon, struck the field. The pressure spike was immense, enough to collapse any known containment shell in standard configurations. The crowd collectively held its breath. Kyle didn't flinch. He manually redirected the focus from energy to flow, stretching the vector responsible for dispersion while narrowing the one holding pressure. The triangle bent, its sides warping in soft light, but it did not break. The quake passed. The system recalibrated. Balance returned. Not one fracture appeared in the simulation's containment walls. The AI voice returned, now tinged with interest. System recognizes sustained stabilization beyond theoretical maximums, initiating tertiary threat simulation. A wall of fire and vacuum erupted in the simulation space, designed to replicate atmospheric venting during planetary tectonic failure. Temperatures surged, wind tunnels reversed. Kyle's model held. He didn't rely on any external code. There were no backup protocols or automated corrections. It was just him, watching the triangle, feeling the push and pull between the 3 points and responding accordingly. Every adjustment was intuitive, not calculated. He wasn't computing, he was tuning. After 17 minutes, the simulation concluded. The forces subsided. The triangle dimmed slowly, returning to a dormant state. The platform lowered, the transparent barriers dissolved. Kyle stood in silence, drenched in sweat, breathing deeply but steadily. The chamber was still. Even the AI said nothing for several seconds. Then the voice declared, "Stabilization complete. No failure events recorded. Triangle configuration verified as viable for dynamic field equilibrium." The crowd erupted. Not in applause, not yet, but in motion. Hands gestured. Recorders blinked. Debates broke out in hushed tones. Faculty members turned toward each other, whispering in rapid-fire dialects. Kyle stepped away from the console, still saying nothing, until the sound of clapping broke through. It was Grohl. She stood at the rear of the observation ring, her thin limbs curled together in the Ferreritan gesture for acknowledgement. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Others began clapping, slowly, awkwardly at first, then more confidently. Even some of the students who had scoffed at him in the past followed suit. Not everyone joined in, but enough did. The sound filled the crucible like a rising current. Kyle didn't bow. He didn't smile. But something inside him settled into place. Zintor remained still. After the others quieted, he finally spoke, his voice amplified throughout the chamber. "While the demonstration meets the technical criteria for success," he said, "the triangle model remains insufficiently peer-reviewed. We will begin committee analysis immediately. Until then, this event is considered provisional." A quiet wave of tension passed through the crowd. Kyle stepped forward, finally raising his voice for all to hear. "Provisional or not, the simulation doesn't lie. You saw it. All of you. It worked." Zintor's expression didn't change. "Reality must be interpreted. One's success does not make a theory." "No," Kyle said calmly, "but it starts one." He walked out of the crucible without another word, leaving behind a space that had forever changed. In the hallway beyond, as the doors closed behind him, his slate pinged softly with a new notification. Galactic Board summons requested. Subject: Ward Model Application. He exhaled, allowing the faintest hint of a smile. The triangle had passed its first test. The battle ahead would not be one of numbers, but of voices. And Kyle was ready to be heard. The circular chamber of the Galactic Theorem Board was unlike any other room Kyle had stood in before. It was not just a place of discussion or arbitration. It was a shrine to logic, designed to intimidate as much as to inspire. A ceiling of shifting nebulae swirled high above, calculated in real time from telescopic arrays across the Orion Belt. The floor was made of black gravimetric stone that softly echoed every footstep with deliberate precision. Suspended in the center of the room, on an elevated platform surrounded by concentric circles of council representatives, Kyle stood alone, his silhouette outlined by a beam of light so exact it felt like a surgical instrument. Surrounding him were the appointed theorem holders, Mathematical authorities selected from every Tier 1 species, each granted a seat after achieving not less than 5 confirmed paradigm shifts in their respective disciplines. Some sat in biomorphic chairs, others levitated. Some projected themselves as holographic fragments from across the galaxy. None spoke, yet all watched. At the head of the circle floated arch-theorist Sylin Val, a spherical being of translucent plasma housed within a containment shell of gold-veined quartz. Her presence was both fluid and commanding. She pulsed with gentle orange light as she addressed the room, her voice resonating through every wall. Today's hearing convenes to examine the formal status of the configuration presented by Cadet Kyle Ward, designated Ward Triangle Model, following its demonstration in the Crucible under full simulation protocols. The lights shifted and the triangular hologram hovered in the center of the room, rotating slowly, glowing softly at each of its 3 vertices. Kyle had rehearsed the coming moments over and over during the sleepless nights between the simulation and now. He had read every precedent, studied every theorem board ruling, memorized cross-species citation protocols. Still, when the lights dimmed and all focus turned to him, he felt his pulse accelerate, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what was unfolding. "Cadet Ward," said Sylin Val, "you may proceed with your defense." Kyle stepped forward. His voice, though amplified, carried a human lilt among the sharp, clipped inflections of the gathered minds. "This model," he began, gesturing toward the triangle, "is not a numerical equation in the conventional sense. It is a structural expression of balance between force vectors, energy, pressure, and flow, mapped in real time. The configuration adapts dynamically to stress changes without recalibration. Its effectiveness does not come from complexity, but from simplicity applied with purpose." A murmuring pulse flickered across a few delegates, a signal of interlinked commentary occurring within private channels. He knew most found his approach crude. He had prepared for that. "I know this presentation lacks the traditional format you're used to. There is no 20-page reduction, no interspecies notation mesh, because it doesn't need one. It's a triangle. That's all. And it works." He turned his gaze directly toward the representative from Zetherion, a crystalline entity named Archex Vol, known for harsh rulings and an aversion to unorthodox theories. "If elegance is your metric," Kyle continued, "then I submit this: the triangle stabilizes field collapse faster than recursive models with less than 0.001% of their energy requirements. It sustained pressure pulses beyond the failure limits of every known tertiary model, all with 3 variables, 3 angles, and no external computation. If that's not elegant, then we've redefined the word to mean impenetrable." Archex Vol did not blink. He simply emitted a high-frequency buzz, undoubtedly commentary, before returning to silence. Another representative stirred. This time it was Leo Roth, the dual-brained diplomat from the Kentari system. Her form shimmered like heated air, and when she spoke, her words carried the rhythm of shifting winds. "You claim that instinct played a role in constructing this model, that you did not calculate but felt the balance. How can you trust something so biological in an institution built on precision?" Kyle met her gaze without hesitation. "Because biological instinct is the result of millions of years of environmental equations. Survival itself is a form of continuous math, brutal, unforgiving, and exact. I didn't invent the triangle, I recognized it. The balance already exists. I just saw the shape." This time silence followed, a thoughtful silence. A holographic window opened beside Sylin Val, displaying footage from the Crucible. Frame by frame, the triangle flexed, adapted, and held. Data points scrolled beneath, showing output results, energy consumption levels, stress ratios, failure event absence. It was clinical, undeniable. Sylin Val pulsed faintly. "We acknowledge the integrity of the simulation. What we must determine now is the question of attribution." Kyle felt his chest tighten. Sylin turned toward one of the lower circles, where Professor Zintor stood, his robe laced with the ceremonial insignia of a contributing theorist. "You have filed a claim," she said. "State your position." Zintor's voice carried no emotion. "The triangle model is derived, consciously or not, from work conducted in my lab. The variables it manipulates, energy, pressure, and flow, are foundational to my Tier 3 analysis on spatial dynamics. Cadet Ward's exposure to this research environment likely informed his synthesis. As such, I request co-attribution. Kyle took a step forward, voice firm. That's false. The idea came in the lecture hall before any review of lab materials. I didn't build on your analysis. I bypassed it. Your model treats the forces as sequential. Mine treats them as concurrent and self-balancing. That's not a derivation, it's a rejection. Zintor's tone sharpened. And yet you remained in my program, benefited from its resources. You learned the problem from me. Yes, Kyle said. I learned the problem from you, and I solved it in spite of you. The chamber stirred again. This time the murmurs were louder, the pulses brighter. Sil and Val floated upward slightly, signaling final evaluation. We have heard the statements, we have reviewed the evidence. Deliberation begins. A force field enclosed the central platform, separating Kyle from the rest of the room. It wasn't for protection, it was for neutrality. No influence, no contact, no gestures could reach through. The light dimmed, and the outer rings became a hive of motion. Voices crossing species lines, calculations traded in thought waves, arguments sculpted in silent data exchanges. Kyle stood still. He could see Zintor through the field. The professor didn't look at him. He stood behind his podium with an expression of pristine detachment, as if the outcome meant nothing. It took 22 minutes for the deliberation to conclude. The light returned. The force field dissolved. Sil and Val glowed with the deep amber hue of resolved judgment. The theorem board has reached consensus. The Ward triangle model is hereby recognized as an original contribution to the Galactic Theorem Compendium, Class 2 status, with primary attribution to Kyle Ward. Co-attribution request denied. A wave of illumination passed through the room. Some applauded, some remained motionless. Zintor did not react. He turned without a word and left the chamber through a side corridor. Sil and Val turned to Kyle. You will be assigned a research cluster and granted full algorithmic access. Do not waste what you've done. Kyle nodded. He didn't speak. He simply turned to leave. Outside, the academy looked the same. The walkways still curved gently around gravity wells. The air shimmered with the soft hum of regulated pressure systems. Students moved between halls in patterned flows. But something was different. As he walked toward the Eastern Research Spire, a younger cadet stopped him in the corridor. She was from a water-dwelling race, her skin glistening with a thin membrane of moisture. Is it true you solved it by seeing a shape? She asked quietly. Kyle smiled for the first time in weeks. Yes, he said. I saw a triangle. She blinked, then slowly sketched 3 lines into the condensation of the nearby panel, as if trying to understand what he had seen. As she walked away, others stopped. Others began to talk. Not about his score, not about the board ruling, but about the shape. The truth had begun to spread. Not through papers, not through politics, through vision, through the clarity of something that could be seen and felt, the shape of balance, and it had his name. In the months following the ruling of the Galactic Theorem Board, the Ward triangle model began to propagate beyond the lecture halls and labs of the Academy. What had started as a controversial demonstration evolved into a subject of urgent curiosity across academic worlds. Scientists from Kepleric institutes, engineering consortia in the Varnex clusters, and even deep space architects working on orbit-stabilizing satellites began to request access to Kyle's research logs. It was no longer about theory, it was about function. The triangle had proven itself not only elegant, but applicable. Kyle worked long hours in his new research cluster, a private sector carved into the crystalline ridges of the eastern spire. The structure overlooked the gas layers of Arcane 6, and the windows could shift opacity to reveal views of orbiting moons at will. Here he was no longer a student, no longer under supervision. He was a contributor now, recognized and cited, and though that status brought freedom, it also brought solitude. He had been offered assistance, but he declined them all. What he was building now went beyond documentation. He was constructing models for multi-ventor adaptation, training machines to interpret triangle configurations under unique stress conditions. He moved between design and application, refining the dynamics of each point, how energy resisted collapse, how pressure responded to displacement, how flow redirected inertia. He mapped conditions in silence until the pattern began to behave as an artificial intelligence in its own right, adapting without him. Watching that unfold gave him a sensation he had no word for. It wasn't pride. It was alignment. Despite his achievement, his presence remained polarizing within the academy. Some hailed him as a rare visionary. Others viewed him as a disruptor who had bypassed tradition. Most carried on with their own work, privately integrating pieces of his theory while pretending to ignore it. But the triangle could not be unseen. And so, slowly, begrudgingly, the institution began to reshape itself around the edges of his contribution. Rawl remained his closest ally. She visited often, sometimes without speaking, simply observing his simulations, pulsing gently in approval. She had begun to run parallel applications of the triangle on Farada, where her species struggled with tectonic fluctuations during seasonal expansions of their homeworld's atmosphere. Her initial tests showed promise. She mentioned, without embellishment, that Kyle's model might reduce fatalities in certain zones by 68%. He listened, nodded, but didn't respond right away. The numbers no longer surprised him. What struck him was how quietly the model slipped into the architecture of others' lives. One evening, as he stood alone on the balcony of his quarters, the thin air humming with the music of distant pulse engines, a message arrived through the Academy's sealed transmission channel. It bore the seal of the Planetary Terraforming Union, an organization that rarely contacted researchers directly. He opened it and read in silence. The message was simple. The Union was preparing to test a large-scale application of the Ward Triangle model in a live stabilization sequence during the construction of a synthetic moon. If successful, it would become the new baseline protocol for artificial gravitational centers. Kyle was invited to oversee the operation. They wanted him there, not as a consultant, but as the originator. He accepted. The journey to the test site took him across the outer ridges of mapped space, aboard a diplomatic freighter escorted by survey drones and carrying a crew of specialists from 5 different species. During the journey, no one questioned his presence. There were no sidelong glances or whispered debates. Every crew member knew exactly who he was. One even asked him for an autograph, not because she idolized him, but because she wanted to show her daughter that math could shape stars. The synthetic moon hung in darkness like a frozen pearl, half-built and vibrating with unfinished energy fields. Massive tethers held it in place against tidal waves emitted by a nearby gas giant. The team had attempted 3 previous stabilization protocols. All had failed. Now, with resources stretched and planetary schedules slipping into chaos, the triangle would be tested. Kyle oversaw the calibration in a quiet control dome orbiting the structure. He made no dramatic announcements, offered no poetic predictions. He simply programmed the model, observed the vectors align, and nodded when the sequence was ready. When the test initiated, the core of the synthetic moon vibrated with a force that cracked one of the outer panels. Gravity twisted in on itself, threatening to fold the entire structure into a failed collapse. But the triangle held. Within seconds, the pressure vectors synchronized. Energy, instead of escalating, began to flow into predictable pulses. The tether field steadied. The moon stopped vibrating. For the first time, balance had been achieved. Not temporarily, not through brute force, but with harmony. The engineers didn't cheer. They stood in awe, as if watching a language being spoken they had never heard before but instantly understood. In that moment, Kyle realized the triangle was no longer his. It belonged to anyone who needed it. He remained on site for the full stabilization cycle, answering questions, refining sequences, mentoring those who would eventually implement the model across other projects. He stayed not for recognition, but because he wanted to ensure the model was never corrupted by abstraction. He wanted its purpose to remain clear. Months later, when he returned to the academy, the tone of the campus had changed. The same halls that once echoed with isolation now greeted him with nods of respect. A few students approached him with questions. Some asked if he would teach. He considered the idea and, eventually, agreed to hold a guest seminar. When the day came, he stood before a small group of cadets in a modest room, the same type he had once sat in, silent and underestimated. He said nothing at first. He simply drew 3 lines on the display, forming a triangle. "This shape," he said, "is not an answer. It's an invitation." The students leaned forward, curious. One asked if the triangle could be improved. Kyle smiled. "If improvement isn't the point, it's about recognition. Patterns aren't made, they're seen. Don't look for complexity, look for what endures." After the seminar, he returned to his lab and shut off the lights. The triangle hovered on the display, rotating slowly. He stood and watched it, not as its creator, but as its witness. He had come to the academy as a stranger. He had been dismissed, underestimated, challenged. But he had left something behind that would endure long after his name faded. He had given the galaxy not a formula, but a way of seeing. And that was enough. Some truths did not need defending. They simply needed to be drawn. 3 lines, 3 forces. In balance, forever.